created a universe that is upheld by your power and your wisdom, that is designed in a way that can be understood by mere humans through math and physics. We thank you that you have given us the opportunity to take a look at that this morning, and all the glory that you provide through it. In Jesus' name, amen.
It's too bad he didn't discover that until 10 years after I graduated from college. I might have learned about it in college.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a math major with a physics minor.
Gotcha. Yeah, well.
Oh, so you're going to be able to critique everything he says. Because you're the expert.
So we mentioned this earlier in the class when we were talking about evidence for God's existence. And I had mentioned to you that now we're going to start circling back and hit on some things that we kind of had to skip past quickly at that time. So one of those things is this issue of math. And if you ask the average person, you know, is math of God or of the devil?
Depends whether you're taking it or not.
You might say the devil based on your school experiences or trying to do your taxes. But math is, I think, a really solid evidence for God's existence and reveals certain properties of God that we have always taught through Scripture, in terms of his eternal power, in terms of his sovereignty everywhere, in terms of his provision for us. The something we take for granted is the fact that the universe actually works according to mathematics that we can actually make sense of with human brains. You know, if you think about it, a universe could be created in such a way that is completely unintelligible, that is only understandable by the God who created it, and yet it is actually created in a way that has these fixed laws of physics, and the laws of physics have a language called math that human minds can actually do something with. So that's what we're looking at. Arguably, if materialism is true, and remember materialism is just the belief that the material universe is all there is, right? Everything's made of matter and that's the end of the story. It really doesn't make any sense for the universe to be upheld by laws of mathematics that can actually be understood. So if you think about it, if materialism is true, everything should be made of matter and everything should be constantly changing through some form of evolution, and yet math defies both of those concepts. Okay? What are we looking at here? If you watched the video I sent as a part of this, don't answer.
You sent a video with this? I didn't notice.
I did. Yeah. And really, my recommendation is that you watch the video after. If you find this interesting, go back and watch the video anyway. So it wasn't something I wanted you to necessarily watch in advance.
Say D.
You say D. It's the most obscure looking answer up there. So even if you came into the room completely unfamiliar with what we were talking about today, you might be tempted to choose that one. That one must be right because it's the weirdest answer.
Yeah, there's another math major.
She's a math major, so I'm done with her.
Awesome. Can we agree that if you showed this to the average person, math equation is not the first thought that would enter their brains? That seems fairly obvious. Right? Artists would make the most sense. Largely because most of our familiarity with math equations is that they can be graphed, but are graphed in a way that is pretty predictable and uniform and repetitive, right? You don't expect a math graph of a single equation to produce that level of variation or that level of beauty. And so if you watch the video that I stole most of that part of this presentation from, you'll find one of the things that the speaker, who's Jason Lyle, he's one of the people I've already recommended to you several times. One of the things he phrases about this is that it's as if God put this sort of secret code into creation only to be discovered later once we had the capacity to get there. You know, that's not really the way he phrases it, but I'm paraphrasing a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Like if you like movies a lot, you might be familiar with this term as it relates to movies, an Easter egg. What's an Easter egg in a movie?
I missed that one, I guess.
Okay, an Easter egg is a hidden like thing that you hide and then find, and then it's fun to find the Easter egg, right? Well, often in movies, there are little Easter eggs that are a little bit like if you think of a cameo in a movie, right? Where someone is just somebody really famous is on screen for 2 seconds. It's kind of like that, but with inanimate objects, something that might be in the background that if you watched the movie once you didn't notice, but if you watch it 10 times you finally go, oh, I never noticed that cool thing in the background of that scene. It's a little bit like that you could think of the Mandelbrot set, which is just a part of today's presentation, as an Easter egg that God has put into creation that he knew we would only discover once we got to the point where we had computers. Because it takes a computer, you could actually plot what's on screen right now by hand, technically. Now, you really couldn't, because you just wouldn't have the time and most of what we're looking at here is smaller than, if you think about a number line or a graph, right? This is all inside of 1. Okay? Now you could expand that and make it bigger and do the hand plotting. But so it's kind of cool in that sense. Just by itself, you could just look at this particular topic and go, wow, isn't God amazing that he built this beauty into math? But we're going to go much deeper than that. Okay? So that's just part of it. All right. So what is math? Study of the relationship between numbers. You laugh because if you ask the average person what is math, they're often going to go, I wouldn't know how to define it. How would you define math? Like a lot of concepts, it would be hard for most people to just off the top of their head. Which of these is true of math? Is it made of matter or is it a concept of the mind? Okay. Definitely not made of matter. You can't go get a bucket of math, right? Which of these is true of math? Is it constantly changing or evolving, or is it fixed or invariant?
It's fixed.
It's fixed, right? Like it's not like today 2 + 2 = 4, but tomorrow it might be something else, right? That's not how it works. Which of these do people assume about math? Is math unique to, say, Earth, or do we assume that math concepts would be the same throughout the universe?
Universe.
Have to be the same. Now, some of you stopped and thought about that one a little bit more, and that kind of makes my point, right? Because you could say to me, well, we don't know. We haven't been everywhere in the universe, so we can't know that. But what I'm really asking is, how do we operate? You know, how does NASA operate? Well, they operate as if all of that is fixed throughout the universe. And as I said in the intro, that's kind of interesting, because if the universe is the result of random chance forces, Big Bang, change, evolution, then why would we assume this fixed set of concepts that can be understood throughout the universe? That makes sense in theism, right? Where a God created the universe and upholds it by the word of his power, where he actually wants us to make sense of it. All of that makes sense in theism. It doesn't really make any sense in atheism.
Couldn't we just substitute the word math with logic?
To make the same argument, you mean? Or to, yes, you could.
Yeah.
The exact same arguments that I'm making today can be made when it comes to formal logic.
Or
Why does the world work according to something like the law of non-contradiction?
Or logos.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense if the material universe is a random chance place created by a Big Bang, constantly changing, but it makes perfect sense if the universe is upheld by a logical being known as God. Okay. Invented or discovered?
Well, I remember that there was a big hubbub when somebody discovered zero.
Yeah, that's right.
That's from India, I believe.
Yeah. So you would say, is that proof it's discovered then? This is actually debated in a way that I don't think should be debated. I think it's this is a little condescending, but I think it's obviously discovered, not invented. The reason why we think it's invented is because people like Kepler came along and put a sort of a language to the concept, but the concept already existed before he put the notation to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? So people did create, in a sense, the notation. You could say, like, the difference between Roman numerals and Arabic numerals, for example, is a man-made thing, but the actual concepts that are used, that are described by them, like, if you think about Pythagoras, right? It's like the sum of the angles make up something, or the whatever.
A squared plus B squared equals C squared in a right
The
triangle.
Pythagorean theorem, A squared plus B squared equals C squared.
In a right
Okay?
triangle.
In a right triangle.
Right triangle.
Okay, but the point is, did that only become true once Pythagoras? Yeah, no, that's a discovery. Okay, so that's interesting, because now we're talking about a concept of the mind that has always existed. So it existed before human minds. Whether you're a materialist or a creationist, it would still have to exist before human minds. So where does it come from? Okay.
An even later example is Fibonacci.
Yes, yeah, and we're going to get into the Fibonacci sequence today and the golden ratio. And if that sounds intimidating to you, I promise this is a very simple, just more like wow kind of view of those things anyway. Just a review, materialism or naturalism is the belief that the material and natural world is all that there has ever been. Which worldview then makes sense of this? This is a little bit of a rhetorical question at this point, but you've got universal, invariant laws that are concepts of the mind that existed before human minds. And my argument is there's only one worldview that makes sense of that, or at least when you think about the two that we're talking about here, right? If you just frame it as, you could argue that's a false dichotomy. It's not just Christianity or just atheism, and that would be true, right?
That's pretty close to an oxymoron.
This is an argument more for theism than it is for Christianity, right? So this goes way back to before we were even giving evidence for Christianity, although, again, these qualities are very consistent with the God we worship, right? Sovereign throughout the universe. In a naturalistic worldview, where everything is a product of Big Bang, random chance forces, there's no reason to expect that the universe should be governed by universal invariant concepts of the mind that existed before human minds. This is what I'm about to say next is another potential logical fallacy. Okay, so if you remember anything about logical fallacies from early on, potentially this is a fallacy called appeal to an expert, where if I were to make the whole argument for this concept being proof of God's existence off of this one guy's quote, that'd be bad logic. I'm not doing that, okay? I'm just saying, here's an example of someone who doesn't hold our worldview. As far as I know, he's a materialist, who is saying exactly the same things about this that we would as theists. It's difficult to avoid the impression that a miracle confronts us here, or that two miracles, the laws of nature, so physics and chemistry, right, and of the human mind's ability to divine them or understand them. To him, looking at this at an expert level, his area of expertise is physics. He's just looking at it and he's saying the same thing that I've just been saying for the last 5 minutes. It doesn't make any sense if there is no God. It shouldn't be that way if materialism is true. And then he said the miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. Okay, and again, just one guy, you could say, big deal. All I'm offering it for is to say, here's at least one example that I'm not making up, how weird it is that the universe works this way, if you were a materialist, it doesn't make any sense.
And he's saying it's a gift from the universe, or unknown?
I've tried to research that, and I've never found a definitive answer for anybody pinning him down on what that means. My guess is that he probably deliberately, this is fairly old quote, 1960, I think. I'm guessing he was intentionally ambiguous with that. You know, if people asked him, he probably.
He could still enjoy the wonder
Yeah.
of the whole thing.
Yeah.
No, I'm not being facetious,
Yeah.
but there is a sense of wonder. You study
Yeah.
this stuff, isn't
Yeah.
there?
And yes, for sure, absolutely.
I mean, you as a teacher with students, there are moments of just wonder, isn't it? Where some
Yeah.
of the rest of us would say, what is he doing? But there are times you just think this is wonderful.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yep. From a materialist perspective, there is a tendency to take these things of wonder and just essentially make them God, as if they're self-generating wonderful things. And so, you know, that's where you get ideas like Mother Nature, and, you know, if I were to say, where did this come from? They might say, from the universe. Well, wait a minute. We know a lot of things about the universe that show that can't be the ultimate source of all this. The universe itself had a beginning, for example, which, you know, you see how all these things tie together. So just to kind of break this down a little bit, in a random chance materialistic universe, the fact that the laws of physics obey math is so improbable that he's calling it a miracle. And the fact that the laws can be understood by human minds is a separate miracle. So there's what's out there, and the fact that it actually has this mathematical quality to it, and the fact that human minds actually have the capacity to process that, he's talking about that as a separate miracle. From a Christian perspective, this reality makes perfect sense. Our universe was created by an omniscient God, a God who knows everything, and it's upheld by his power and his very nature. So when you think about logic, for example, why are there laws of logic? Because anything that would defy a law of logic would actually defy God's actual nature. Part of it shows his love, right? Part of his love and provision for us includes creating the universe in a way that allows for this. If you think about it, this is one of many things about the way God has created the world that makes science possible. And I think science is a gift from God, that, like the whole world is a kind of Easter egg for us, right? He's built it in a way.
15 hours of cornfields.
Yeah, and I would
Yes,
say I would never
amazing.
put that into that category. 1 hour of cornfields, and thinking about how God has allowed us to manipulate and make, you know, do farming is an amazing thing. I don't need 17 more hours of that. Math is an intentional creation of God that serves as a language. You'll even hear mathematicians call math the language of God, because it is so ubiquitous throughout the universe. Like everything in the world can be, even beauty can often be understood through math or found in math. So there's an argument to be made that Lyle says this shows us how God thinks. And if you think about it, again, if all of creation sort of obeys the laws of math in physics and chemistry, that's a fair argument. We can assume, so in theism, we can assume that they're universal because God is omnipresent, right? You don't have to wonder if the laws of math are true on Alpha Centauri because God's present there too. That's not weird. But in a materialistic worldview, you have to steal that idea. You have to kind of assume something that you have no reason to believe in the way that we have a reason to believe it. It makes sense that the laws of math don't change because God doesn't change. Perfect sense in theism, perfect sense in Christianity. Doesn't really make sense if the universe is the product of a Big Bang followed by billions of years of evolution. Now, I'll say this to atheists, and they'll just look at me like I'm crazy, like I'm making up stuff, like I'm just making an assertion. And I say, well, why do you assume those things? Why do you assume that it's not changing and that because it just is? That's the whole argument. It's just it doesn't bother them at all. Like to them, just assuming that it is that way makes more sense than my claim that it had to come from this supernatural source. Okay. In the Christian worldview, it makes sense that this is to me one of the biggest ones. Because you could say, if it's a concept of the mind, and then humans sort of, it then springs from the mind of humans, you could see how that might support the materialistic view on math. But the realization that it's not dependent on human minds, that all of the things that we can explore through physics and math were true before human minds, that's a little wrinkle. A lesser evidence for God would be what I said before. Like, you could look at everything that we're going to look at today and go, wow, that's beautiful. Must be God. And I wouldn't disagree with you. Okay? In fact, I've said this before in other situations. I think everyone in this room could sit around and look at the miracle of human reproduction and human life and those kinds of things, or the complexity of the eye, and say, whoa, isn't God amazing? But if you're talking with a non-believer, what that seems like from the outside is we're just fairly simple-minded, and we're wowed by amazing things, and it's merely the amazingness of it that makes us leap to higher being. Okay, so I wouldn't use the boy isn't this beautiful as the top of my arguments for God's existence, even though I think it's still one argument that's still true. I think it still works. What's this?
A series of numbers.
Fibonacci.
Do you ever fist bump? Nice. Fibonacci
Yeah,
sequence.
Well, he's got
Fibonacci
this.
sequence. No. He just knew
He would
that.
know.
I'm just teasing.
They use that in investing too.
Really?
I
So-
figured it. I didn't know what it was, but I figured it out within about 5 seconds.
Yeah, you can. Sorry, I can't fist bump you from this end of the table. You can look at this and figure out what's happening here, right? So you just add 0 plus 1 and you get 1, and you add 1 plus 1 and you get 2, and you add 1 plus 2 and you get 3, and then you just keep going like that, and that's all it is. It's fairly simple. That's math, right? That's just one thing under the umbrella of math.
Base 10.
Okay. Yeah. Don't do that. You're just trying to flex on us. Okay. So it's the Fibonacci sequence. Graphing that sequence gives us something that you may have heard of before called the golden ratio. Graphing might not quite be the right terminology, but I'll show you what I mean when I say that. Both of those are, again, math concepts, but both are found in nature. And I think that alone is weird. Like, somebody just sat down and went, it'd be fun. You could, in fact, I would be willing to bet that thousands or millions of elementary school children over the years have done the Fibonacci sequence without knowing that it's the Fibonacci sequence, right? It's the math equivalent of doodling. Oh, it'll be fun. Let's see where this goes. This plus this plus this plus this plus this. I know I've done things like that. Not the Fibonacci sequence, but more like what would happen if you combine these numbers this way. So I find it really strange that something so ridiculously elementary and conceptual is actually found in the natural world too. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why would that be? Well, that's a weird coincidence. We find them in places like sunflowers and pine cones. I'll show you a couple of examples of that. Okay, so if you stripped away the lines that have been superimposed here or if you can really concentrate it on it enough to see the seeds there, right? It just so happens that if you count out the arcs all the way through one direction, there are 34 of them. And if you count them the other direction, there are 55 of them. Guess where you find those two numbers?
It's gotta be Fibonacci.
They're in the Fibonacci sequence.
Yeah, what?
They're in the Fibonacci
Fibonacci.
sequence.
Oh, yeah.
Why? Do you see how random that is? Like, totally disconnected, bizarre thing just happens to be found here in nature, and it's actually found in lots and lots of places. You can do the same thing by looking at the bottom of a pine cone, count those swirls, you get a number that happens to be a number that's also on the Fibonacci sequence. Seems like another Easter egg.
Amazed by those things, I like math.
The golden ratio also happens, okay, I obviously don't think it's coincidental, I think it's designed. And I don't think it's designed with any functionality necessarily in mind. I think it's meant to be one of these little signatures of God that makes someone go, whoa. And it goes all the way back to the Romans passage that we harped on so much early on. It basically says God doesn't believe in atheists. Why? Because everyone knows he exists through what he has made, and that's everything from the existence of life to the relationship between the moon and the earth and the sun to stuff like this. It's just everywhere. Okay. It's even used. So this is the golden ratio, and if you see how that's concocted, right? You start with the first two numbers on the Fibonacci sequence, and then another square, and then a 3 by 3, and then a 5 by 5, and these are all numbers up the sequence, right? And then if you try to make a single line from corner to corner to corner to corner to corner to corner to corner, that is the golden ratio, okay? And it just so happens to show up all kinds of places. So if you look up either the inside or the outside of a snail shell, for example, if you look at the way a lot of companies create their logos are based off of the golden ratio because the human mind likes the golden ratio. It's kind of wild. There is a similar connection between nature and math and something called a Varroanoid diagram. Ever heard of this one? Me either. I mean, before I started teaching, when I'm teaching, but I know about it now. This is all it is, okay? And again, you could imagine someone doing this, like the first discovery of this being just someone thinking, boy, it would be fun to do this thing. And all it requires is I actually skipped a step here. What we do when we do this in class is we have students do this. And what you do is you take out a piece of paper and you put dots all over the paper. Okay? Then the next step is to draw lines between all the dots. Okay? So imagine that without the little red lines. And then you bisect those lines. That's the next step. Then you take those intersecting points and you draw lines. And what you get is this result. Now, the goal is to create shapes where every line of the shape is no closer to another dot than it is the dot inside the shape. Okay, so look at one shape. Look at the biggest shape at the bottom middle. Okay, the idea is what we've done is we've created a shape where every line on that is no closer to an outside dot than it is the inside dot. And if you try to do it by hand, you can't really do it. But if you do all this bisecting of lines, you can do it. Okay? Now, does that image look at all familiar? Turtle shell is one of the places where we see this, yeah.
Looks like skin cells to me.
Skin cells, good one.
I find this stuff fascinating.
Have you ever looked at Dragonfly Wing?
It doesn't work.
Honeycomb?
Honeycomb.
Okay.
Cornfields.
Okay, that must be the dragonfly, right?
Yep.
That is gorgeous.
Oh.
That's why we're fascinated with
Interesting.
giraffes.
Oh, crap, you're on. Tried that. Huh.
So you could put a dot in the middle of each of those, and it would follow the math of the Varroanoid thing. Now you probably need a computer to get that dot placed correctly, but it's still there, right? Why? Why this fairly random, simple mathematical idea that is the little dots and everything that we were talking about? Why is it all over nature? Now, again, if you're not a theist, you're gonna try to figure out a way to just say, well, there's something about molecules that have to conform to this.
Gravity.
Yeah.
That have to.
Yeah, yeah. That it just has to be that way, or otherwise it wouldn't be. So, like the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio and the Varroanoid diagrams, they're discovered through these natural elementary school processes and found in nature. Another thing is the Mandelbrot set. Now, I don't know what's going to happen here. Normally, my PowerPoints are about 35 slides long. Today's PowerPoint is 127 slides long. So I don't know what's about to happen. Maybe we'll get, I think it's gonna work, actually. But if for some reason we just have to say, all right, we didn't get through everything, I'm just gonna say, go watch the video that I emailed, okay? But the rest of this is Mandelbrot set stuff. If you're watching at home, my recommendation, and again, I know there are a couple people who definitely always do, just pause your video on this, write down that link. If you're on my email list, you already got this link.
Is this the same
Okay,
one?
the same one,
Okay.
yeah. And Lyle has given this presentation half a dozen times on YouTube, so there's different versions of it out there. If you just put Jason Lyle Mandelbrot set or fractals, I don't think I put the word fractal anywhere on this handout, but I do want to explain what a fractal is. Yeah, Angelina.
So is this the video you sent?
Should be.
Is it YouTube legal if I copy it and put it in the chat for the people that are on?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Is Jason Lyle the one who did the universe video of the planets?
Yes.
That you sent us? Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
I feel like that kind of goes hand in hand with this too.
Look, Lyle, by the way, I'll just mention this. Lyle is the best combination by far of all of the different aspects of this class. Like if I could only give you one person, it would be Jason Lyle, because he's an astrophysicist who is well studied on almost every area that you can think of apologetics, and he is a young Earth creationist. So very often what you find is that there are really good Christian apologists on science and math and all those kinds of things, and they tend to be less orthodox on some of those other things. Now, I've already said, I think you can make an argument for young Earth, old Earth. I don't think anybody should hinge their whole faith on that or anything, but I'm just saying if you like the idea of, yep, I'm ardently young Earth, the universe is 6,000 years old, Lyle shares that view, even with a scientific perspective on all of those things, okay? All right, so these other slides, I'm just going to go through them really fast. You'll notice I literally just stole them from his presentation. So the whole concept is this set, right? Mandelbrot set. What's a set? It's just a set of numbers that belong together for whatever reason. So you could imagine if I were to take all the possible numbers that exist and say, what's the set of even numbers? You could all create a set of even numbers, right? And that would even include negative even numbers. If I were to say create a set of negative numbers, you could create a set of negative numbers. The Mandelbrot set is all the numbers that can be plugged into this formula and the result stays small. Okay? Now the first time I heard that, I thought that was a little weird. It sounded arbitrary. Stays small. What's going to qualify as stays small? But it actually, I think it will make sense here in a minute. So if you just plugged in a 0 into the equation, okay, what you get is these results. So what happens is you take 0 and you plug it into the formula up at the top for Zn, okay, and then you go, it gives you a result of 1, and then you take the 1 and you put it back into the equation, and then the answer comes out as a 2, and then you take the 2 and you put it back into the equation, and it comes out with an answer of 5. And then you put the 5 back in the equation, and it comes out with an answer of 26. You put the 26 back in, and now what do we know about this one? It's not staying small, right? So even though small sounds subjective, you can see what we're talking about. It doesn't stay small, it just keeps going, okay? Going over your head? Okay. We'll see if it continues to go over your head or if
It will.
starts to make sense. Okay, so then the next number, in this case, I think what he plugged in to start off was -1. Okay, so he put in a -1, and that gives you a result of 0. You put the 0 back in, and you get -1. You put the -1 back in, and you get 0, and that just goes on forever. So that number, -1, is a part of the Mandelbrot set. The first number, 0, is not a part of the Mandelbrot set. All right? Now this will really bother you, Cheryl.
I'm sure it will.
I never even knew about this. Imaginary numbers. You math people might love that.
Yes.
There's a thing called imaginary numbers. I think that's cruel. I think no one should be required to distinguish between imaginary and real numbers, given the fact that imaginary numbers are supposedly real.
Imaginary numbers aren't real.
They exist according to Jason Lyle, but there's a distinction between imaginary and real numbers. And what he goes on to describe in the video then is, like, you can, since imaginary numbers wouldn't fall on a number line, then you can think of them more on a plane, okay, a different spot. And then basically, after doing the math that we just talked about, which again, for those of us who aren't into math, it sounds complicated, but when you think about all you're doing is taking an equation and taking a number that you've chosen. Does 12 fit in there? Let's see what we get when we do the math on that. 13, let's try that. And you just keep doing that relatively simple math equation and find out which numbers belong to the set, which don't belong to the set. And you start to plot them out, and these little black dots are the plotting of what belongs to the Mandelbrot set. Okay. The red ones they don't belong. Now that alone is fairly weird to me, because again, my limited experience with math is that I would expect the results of an equation to give something more uniform than that. It seems weird, seems random. But if you graph it out completely, which you need a computer to do because there's so many data points, okay? And this is where it becomes very interesting, where Minnie's talking about, boy, it's too bad this came out after I was, out of school. Yeah, this is something that I was finally discovered. There's some argument over who really discovered it. Benoit Mandelbrot got all the credit, but once you had computers, you could actually do the graphing of this in a way that is just going to blow your mind, I think. Okay. Now again, notice the main shape here is on a fairly small part of this number graph, right? This is all, that's actual 1, and it's not even all the way out to 1, okay? And what he's done with the coloring here is just taken some liberties, and there's a practical reason for it, and there's sort of just a, hey, it's beautiful to think about it this way, okay? So what he's done is he said, everything that's in black belongs to the Mandelbrot set. Everything that's colored doesn't belong. And in order to just draw the lines properly, he's made the numbers that are close but not in the set the brighter color, okay? And what that does is it creates really thin lines that are in the graph that you wouldn't be able to see if he didn't create the contrast, okay? So that's the main reason for the different colorings. The colorings are, you could choose any colorings you wanted, and he changes them throughout the presentation. So that's what it looks like without the actual lines, okay? And the main shape is a cardioid, which you know, if you've ever done a spirograph or anything like that, you may have done a cardioid before. You can see these are all just screenshots from his presentation. Some interesting mathematical properties of the Mandelbrot set. If you look at all of these different little offshoots off the main shape, the 3 there represents that you have this fork, and the 3 is 1, 2, 3. Do you understand? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that has 3. Now, to my way of thinking, again, I keep expecting it to just be repetitive. So in my head, all the other little cardioids off of there ought to also have little spokes of 3, but they don't. To infinity, which is also weird because that little V down there, it's an actual convergence of shapes. They actually touch. But if you follow it, you will follow it forever because it will fragment infinitely. You can just go into that space forever. Now on the other side, again, my simple mind is, oh, well, there must be odd on the other side. But it's obvious he didn't put them on the other side, so there's something else going on. And sure enough, if you go the other direction, all those spikes are even, not odd. Strange. And even more interesting is that he likes to say they can do math. They can do addition. So where do you think we're going to find 8? So if you take the 2 biggest ones on the left side and you add the number of spikes, then the biggest shape between them happens to have that number of spikes.
So is the other side 7?
Yeah.
So we must live in that world.
I mean, I feel like I have to go back and find all my math teachers. 'Cause they did not do a good job.
What do you mean they didn't do a good job?
I don't know what any of this stuff is. Or do they teach this in school? The Fibonacci
You don't need to
sequence?
know this.
Okay.
This is the math equivalent. This is the math equivalent of going to an art museum.
Okay.
I don't think there's any practical application of this. Now, what I thought you might have meant, I would have agreed with,
Yeah.
if you'd have said they failed in that they didn't use this to make me excited about math. That I might be able to agree with.
This is also true. Yeah.
I don't know if it would work. I don't know if the average 10-year-old would look at this and go, wow, I love math now. I doubt it, but it couldn't hurt, in my opinion. Okay, so some other mind-blowing things about this shape. So there's now, in some cases, like you'll notice some of them are blurry. I deliberately screenshotted some blurry ones to show you what he's doing in his video is he's actually zooming in. It's pretty cool to see him go from one part of the shape to another part of the shape. This is him zooming in on, let's go back a spot. Like you see that little teeny tiny shape on the end? Well, that's just another Mandelbrot set. And guess what? Now again, my simple mind would assume that shape is just a duplicate of the bigger shape. It'd still be cool that there's a small one out there, but I would expect it to be just repetitive. It's not repetitive. It's very similar, but it has its own, like it's got all kinds of additional shoots and all the shapes are the same, but the number of them changes. And you can, again, you could do that forever. You could keep zooming in on the little baby Mandelbrot over and over and over and over again. You'll
And
never.
they're all within, like,
Yes.
wow.
Yeah. Not sure why I have several shots of that same. So this is him zooming in on a valley. They call it a valley. Okay.
So doesn't ever touch.
This is the Valley of the Seahorses. Can you figure out why it's called the Valley of the
Yeah.
Seahorses?
They're pretty.
And at this point, he makes the point in the presentation that the color doesn't matter, and he changes the color. That's zooming in a little far on one of the upside down seahorses. By the way, if I say something's the Valley of whatever and you don't see the thing, don't feel bad. The first couple of times I watched this video, I was almost angry. Like, stop calling it that. That shape is not there. So within those individual, more artistic-looking components are all kinds of crazy things that you can zoom in on forever. And just here are some of those individual.
Suns or two egg yolks.
Yeah.
Further, further.
It's fascinating.
Okay, so now, see what we're doing here. We're zooming in on some of those things I showed you before in this Valley of the Seahorses, and zooming in, zooming in, zooming in. And you look at it and you go, oh, I've seen that. You know, that's an optical illusion that you see at some art store or whatever, right? But notice there's a little dark dot in the middle there. What's that going to be?
Yeah, kiss.
Another, yeah. What do you call that?
We're just calling it a Mandelbrot set, even though
Set,
that, yeah.
another
I mean,
set.
technically that's not the Mandelbrot set, but that's
Right.
what he calls them. It's a baby Mandelbrot.
Baby.
Baby Mandelbrot, yeah. And you'll notice on the end of that is another one, and if you keep zooming in, they're there too, okay?
It's a wonder someone hasn't built a New Age religion around this stuff.
I wouldn't be shocked to
Isn't
find,
that pretty?
yeah, now think about this.
That's beautiful.
Now go back to the math that was a little bit annoying at the beginning because you're like, math, equations, get that out of here.
Yeah.
And he even presents it that way. He says he hates broccoli. And, you know, his mom always, you know, he always had to eat the broccoli before he could get his dessert kind of thing. And he presents it kind of, the math equations are the broccoli, and then this is the dessert. But this is just, that slide alone is mind-blowing to me.
Mhm.
Not just because it's beautiful, but because it just so defies what I think a math equation should give you.
It's ordered.
Yeah, it's ordered in a creative way. That's the key. It's ordered in a creative way. It keeps creating as you zoom in on it, right? It's like it's a new creation as you go in. Here's some more shapes if you zoom in on the right spots of the Mandelbrot. This is all within the original shape that I showed you. Okay, this is all zooming in on that shape. This is the Valley of the Bow Ties.
Oh, look at that. There's a little one in there.
And there's a little one in there. Yep, there sure is. There he is.
Oh my gosh.
Oh,
Oh, wow.
Oh, this one's going the other way.
Valley of the Bow Ties.
it's almost like a quirk.
Now, if you showed this to me 10 years ago, and you told me that that's the plotting of a math equation, you could not have convinced me. You couldn't have convinced me that that's a math equation. Here's another spot. So they go out to the outside right of the cardioid, and you get the Valley of the.
Broccoli.
Anybody see any shape?
They look like the balls
Oh, elephants.
pool.
It's the Valley of the Elephants.
Oh, down
Look
there.
at the bottom.
Yes, at the bottom.
Yeah, elephant.
Look at them.
Oh, now I see it.
Blankets over his back.
Huh.
I would never have chosen elephant.
With an umbrella.
But look at that trunk.
Uh-huh.
Swelling the tail of the one in front of it.
Mhm.
They do it, they walk.
Mhm.
So there's two elephants.
There it is.
You could argue they're standing on a ball. Imagine them at the circus.
Mhm.
This is zooming in on just a part of that. And that's, I promise you, I didn't lace anybody's coffee with,
It's like the.
yep, another little baby Mandelbrot. Now you can see he's really taken some liberties with the colors now.
Yeah.
I would not present this topic to somebody as evidence of God's existence using this one because the colors kind of cheat, I think.
But it makes it clearer
It
to
does.
see.
It does. It does. I just think when he goes to more than two-tone, that's cheating.
Cheating.
Two-tone I'm fine with, but you know, multiple colors I think is, again, and he's at this point what he's trying to do is keep the people who are watching the video interested by getting just a little bit more, having a little fun with it.
Yeah.
You can actually change the equation a little bit and get
Ooh.
different factors.
See the sevens.
Oh.
And what does that look like?
Well,
Flowers?
Mhm.
crowns on that. The little circles.
So that's just some of that if you zoomed in more on it. I'm gonna bring something back up later on that previous one. All right, so the conclusions he ends up coming to at the end of his video are similar to the things we've already said. Okay, what does this all mean? These are fractals, by the way. I mentioned I was going to tell you what a fractal was. A fractal is just any image where you can't tell how close you are. You can't tell how close you are because it repeats over and over and over and over again. So like if you were to look at like a snowflake and zero in on it the way that we were, you couldn't tell, am I looking at the whole snowflake or am I looking at a portion of the snowflake? That's what a fractal is, okay? So he asks some questions like what causes the beauty in these things, what causes the complexity in these things, and he does a similar process. He says, well, humans didn't do this. This is built into the equation, right? What causes the complexity? Again, he argues it's not like the computer creates this; it just plots it.
It's just as if there's no such thing as randomness.
Well, that's a whole deeper philosophical thing we're not going to get into today, but yeah. So again, you know, these things make sense if they stem from the mind of God. They really don't make sense outside of that. Again, these are all similar things to what we already said. But what's kind of interesting is that just like the Fibonacci sequence, just like the golden ratio, and just like Varroanoid, you can actually see some of these things show up in nature too, which is by itself an interesting thing. Why is it in math and nature? We mentioned snowflakes. This is frost on a window, right? It would follow some of those same properties. Now that one's a little bit easier to I think, brush off if you're a materialist, because there is a chemical process to why frost works the way that it does, okay? Ferns, if you've ever looked closely at a leaf of a fern, is the same as the whole fern, and then you can keep going in like that. It's kind of wild. This is my favorite one. What did you say?
Cauliflower.
Cauliflower is a pretty good guess.
Broccoli.
It's broccoli. It's
There,
Roman.
no, see, I was just early on that
I
answer.
know.
I knew we could get broccoli in there.
Romanesque broccoli. And if you zoom in on it and zoom in on it and zoom in on it, you get what looks like just repetitions of these little pine tree looking pieces, if you will. Earlier I asked you what that one looked like. Thought maybe somebody would think snowflake. Now, snowflakes alone would be one of those things where a lot of people would just be like, how can you deny God's existence after looking at a snowflake? That to me just doesn't look like it could be a natural thing. It's just got so many.
Symmetrical.
It's both symmetrical and beautiful, right? There's the symmetry to it, and then there's all this sort of extra stuff. Like, you could argue a circle is symmetrical. So the symmetrical part is just a component of it. And yet, all these little different layers and bumps and shapes and so on.
I've heard that there are no two identical snowflakes.
I have heard that. I think that's
Yeah.
true. I think that's
Yeah.
accurate. Yeah. Now, how you could ever know? I'm always like, when a student brings that up, I usually say, "How would you know? How could
Have
you
you
test
looked
That's
that?"
why I say I've
Yeah,
heard.
yeah. But so here in the presentation, what he's doing is he's just showing places where you can see this in nature and you see this in math. The one on the left is a mathematical graph called a Barnsley fern. And then he asked some of the same questions that we've already kind of explored. And then he quotes Wigner. And I think we made it through the whole thing with time to spare. Yes, sir.
Yes. I am more interested in beautiful worship than in beautiful apologetics, which has been very obvious in the class that I know so little about apologetics. And I am fascinated, I haven't done studies on this, but since you're so much better at this than I am, that mathematicians, at least in the Roman Catholic Church, have produced the more beautiful music, artful things that have come in worship life, especially when it comes to things like the psalmody. And you said something that strikes me about beauty. Is beautiful worship mathematical? Can it be graphed? And you said beauty, order in a creative way. Is beautiful worship actually just order in a creative way under the image of God? I'm sorry, you led me to this by your class.
I'm not bothered at all.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a cool thought. What's interesting is that I think how many of you have ever seen the movie Dead Poets Society? Okay.
Yeah.
The opening part of that movie has Robin Williams' character having his students tear out a portion of their English textbook.
Yeah.
Because it describes how you can understand poetry or appreciate poetry through mathematical formula.
Yeah.
And I think most people go, "Nice job, Robin." You know, you stick it to those people who want to reduce beautiful things to mathematics. And yet, I think you're onto something.
Well, no, but the thing is, I was at a workshop that was talking about every fourth generation is the poetic generation, and there is a cadence, a rhythm to how they express things, and it can be mathematically described. I remember that
For sure.
presentation.
Especially
And
music.
That's the generation.
Music
that
is
brings-
math.
That brings in the great thing, but there is, and that's the beauty of it when you learn the cadence.
Yeah.
Beautiful worship, there's a cadence with it. There is
Mhm.
something to it. The chant, there's a cadence. I mean, you watch me on some of the stuff, I'm always going back and forth, going to the chant with the cadence, because
Yeah.
there is beauty with the words, how it comes together.
Yep.
There's beauties in singing the psalmody to the various forms. Once you learn it, it takes time, because
Yeah.
this stuff in mathematics, it takes time to discover the beauty of 1 +
All those
1
things are
equals
true. Yep.
2. Or 1 + 1 + 1 = 1, depending how you want to
Yeah.
express that beauty. But it takes time, and once you have that cadence, that beauty, there's this wonder,
Mhm.
and that wonder just does something. You know,
Yeah.
I'm probably strange, but people already know that.
No, I think I agree with everything that you said for once.
I'm fascinated by the beginning of the book of John. You know, in the beginning was the word, the logos,
Yeah.
logic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I wanted to put a plug in for math teachers. I did teach fractals in a senior class called Math Topics. but it just brushed on, like it brushed on Roman numerals for
Yeah,
one.
right.
The most practical was it brushed on keeping your finances.
Right.
But it brushed on fractals, and they
Mm.
had them build, like you physically build things, which
Mhm.
was good for my math class.
Mhm.
But I didn't even know that it
Yeah.
was called that. Like
Yeah.
fractals was the only thing I knew
Right.
it was called, so.
Right.
I still do
But a
math
little
with
plug.
my shoes off.
But there's a beauty in that, there's a symmetry in that, you got five, the
Five,
rose
five,
petal
five
is
is
five,
yeah.
five,
10,
five,
20.
Higher math.
Let's
It's
pray.
all part of God's creation, replicated in nature.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you again for your beautiful creation and for the way that you have created it in a way that we can continue to explore it and will never grow tired of the new discoveries that you have laid out before us. Lord, we thank you for fingers and toes. We thank you for the opportunity that we have to be together here and to worship you in the service upcoming. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
You know, I had a higher level math professor in college tell the class they calculus was invented